Thank you. We also have another government official I want to acknowledge in the room, Abdi Mohammed, also known as Bafo, from the government of Somalia. He's their resilience coordinator. So welcome. Thank you for joining. So now I'm very pleased to welcome to the stage our panel of donors who are seated at this table. I will acknowledge that Imogen is amongst the most resilient among us. After less than a week of returning from maternity leave, she hopped on a plane with her new baby and joined us here today. So thank you for that. So please join us up here. Imogen, Stefan Hallegate, and Renate Hallen. Please join us up here. So as they're coming up, I'll give some introductions. Stefan, on the far right, is the lead economist with the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, the GFDRR, at the World Bank. Among other things, Stefan was the lead author of a seminal World Bank report on resilience called Unbreakable, Building the Resilience of the Poor in the Face of Natural Disasters. If you have not seen this report, you need to take a look. It is one of those reports you read and you think to yourself, why wasn't I involved in this? Next is Imogen Parsons, seated next to Stefan. She is the head of the Humanitarian Research and Innovation at UK's Department for International Development, or DFID. Imogen previously led DFID's African Humanitarian Unit and helped launch their Sahel Resilience Platform. She's also has a keen interest and background in conflict and post-conflict settings, and I think that's something over the next few days we'll be discussing is what does this work look like when you're in a conflict, post-conflict setting. And finally, we have Renate Hallen, closest to me here, from the EU delegation to the United States, who's responsible for EU relations with the World Bank and the US, among others. Prior to this job, Renate managed the Aid and Development Effectiveness and Financing Unit of the Directorate General of the International Cooperation and Development, among other roles within the EU and German federal administration, where she focused on debt initiatives for developing countries. So thank you to the panel. Round of applause, please. So I think we can, is this loud enough? So I think we'll stay seated for the panel, have it be a true panel. And before I pass to my colleagues, I thought I'd offer a few of my own reflections to sort of kick us off. So we've now heard several times about this sort of seminal moment in 2011, 2012. Again, that's not when resilience was invented, but it is when there was an aha moment, and people, Tom outlined some of the costs associated with recurrent crisis. Loss of lives and livelihoods, hits to the national and regional economy. We know in Kenya between 2008 and 2011, unfettered drought cost the economy $12.1 billion. And so we often talk about motivating analytics, and that's certainly a motivating analytic for governments. There was similarly a post-disaster needs assessment in Malawi that really got that government thinking about, wow, it's not just that this is costing donors a lot of money, this is actually costing us a lot of money. And then, of course, the cost of recurrent humanitarian spending, which if you rack it up going back in time, 10, 15 years, is absolutely astronomical. So the U.S. government alone spent about $1 billion responding to the Horn emergency in 2011, another $500 million responding with humanitarian assistance to the 2012 drought in the Sahel. That's just one moment in time. Think about where we are now, again, responding to humanitarian crisis. So this initial focus on people and places subject to recurrent crisis, that line that Tom said, it sort of reflects that logic of reducing these costs over time because of the cost of inaction, and we've seen that. Our investments not only go to places where we see recurrent crisis, we're also investing where we see governments taking proactive action to get ahead of this and to manage drought and other risks. And we've seen a lot of examples of governments, some of the same struggles we have of working across our different silos of excellence in health, food security, but governments like the government of Kenya that set up cross-ministerial bodies to actually begin to tackle this problem, not from a sectoral perspective, but from a comprehensive perspective. And for us in USAID, that's really been one of the big challenges and honestly, for some people, resilience in USAID means all the different parts of USAID working together. And that's great because operationally that's what it's required. And it's required for a couple of reasons. One, the evidence is clear that building resilience requires working across sectors. And I think that's a big challenge when you've got, in our organization, a set of health officers, a set of food security officers, a group that works on democracy and government. But it really requires bringing those groups together. The other reason I think the concept of resilience has been attractive as a vehicle for doing that is that every sectoral outcome, as Tom made the point, requires resilience given the risk environments in which we work. So whether it's a health outcome, a food security outcome, an education outcome, everybody has a vested interest in this set of capacities that we've cleverly called resilience. So in USA, we have sort of three big buckets of investment. One that Beth spoke to is expanding economic opportunities. That's in agriculture, for sure. A lot of the rural economies are really, the engine of growth is agriculture. But it's also looking outside of agriculture and helping people, first of all, recognizing the heterogeneity that exists within communities and the fact that not everybody's going to farm or herd their way out of this dilemma. And so what a lot of households are doing is stepping a foot out or moving out. And that's going to be the subject of the Diversifying Livelihood Risk panel that we're have slotted, I think, for later today. A second major bucket of investment is strengthening natural resource management, conflict management, and disaster risk management, as well as strengthening local institutions. And then finally, improving human capital, health, education, et cetera. And I think that's important for us in the sense that it's really a multi-generational investment in building resilience capacities. So let's be clear about what the hypothesis is here. Benjamin Franklin's famous line, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Who here knows what he was talking about when he said that? Nancy? Yeah, it's often used in reflecting health as a preventative, but Benjamin Franklin coined that phrase when talking about fire prevention in Philadelphia. And I think there's an interesting sort of parallel to what we're doing. And we often say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Apparently, it's $1 invested resilience is worth $2.9 in reduced humanitarian spending, avoided losses, and improved well-being outcomes. And we'll hear more about that when Courtney Cabot-Venton and some others talk about value for money. Beth also mentioned the evidence from Ethiopia, and we really got to see in 2016 what resilience looked like when it's being tested. And we did see some powerful evidence that communities reached by comprehensive sets of investment. Among those experiencing the most severe drought conditions, households that were reached by these investments were actually able to manage far better than households that weren't. And that's powerful evidence. I do still think there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done in terms of translating prevention in relation to costs. And we meet with the Office of Management and Budget and others. People really want to know, did we get that, did that prevention actually have us avoid responding to humanitarian emergencies? And we're not there yet in terms of the methodology, and I think that it's super challenging to compare droughts, certainly over time, but even across space. And that's an area of work I think is got to be important going forward. I mentioned this in my introduction. There's also been a growing recognition of the broader relevance of resilience beyond people and places that are subject to recurrent crisis, thanks to Andrew and many of the others that are in this room. But I think there's still a partial understanding about what constitutes that ounce of prevention. In other words, what are the sources of resilience that matter most in particular contexts or across contexts? We're building that evidence. We know that financial services seems to transcend context as a source of resilience. But there's also, what I find super intriguing, is a lot of sources of resilience that actually transcend sectors. Social capital being a very prominent one, the ability to lean on others during times of need. That's not done purely out of generosity, but people are in a reciprocal obligation network. I let you lean on me so that I can lean on you in the future. Also in that sort of transcending sectors in terms of sources of resilience, Women's empowerment. We saw some powerful evidence out of Bangladesh of women's empowerment being one of the primary explanations for why some households move out of poverty and remain out, whereas others move out and fall back into poverty. And I think that's really important because we can all agree that women's empowerment is important in its own right, but if we can take that a step further and say it's also essential for building resilience, I think that's super powerful. There's also some very interesting work that's going to be discussed here on the role of aspirations in relation to resilience. And then, as Beth mentioned, more and more seeing these effective ways to manage drought and other risks, the index-based livestock insurance, sovereign insurance that allows countries to buy an insurance product to insure their own humanitarian liabilities. And there's some really exciting work in that space. And then the last thing, just to sort of reiterate what something Beth said, this entire enterprise of building resilience is predicated on the notion of collective action. USAID, when I was based in Nairobi in 2011, we were first launching these efforts. We had the rather ridiculous whole of USAID. I mean, does it really take a subject like recurrent process to get USAID fully to work together? It has helped. It is for some reason, this concept has helped bridge a lot of divides, and not only the humanitarian development divide. I think we all thought that was the big one. It turns out that it's just as hard to get the food security, health, education people on the development side working together, but we're seeing great progress. So I think I'll leave it there and first pass to Stefan for his reflections on where we are on the state of resilience and resilience evidence.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. It's not a particularly easy task to summarize this at the World Bank. Lots going on. But I want first to tell you that I joined the bank initially to work on inclusive green growth. So you can think of me as a specialist of fuzzy concepts within big organizations. And resilience has been very similar in the sense, like a combination of sort of marketing move, like using a new word to make some progress in some ideas, and at the same time, a lot of content also and a lot of good ideas. And we cannot look at the concept without looking at the two things. There is part of marketing of using a new term just to make some things more visible, and it doesn't have to be a bad thing. I wanted to start with how the concept has evolved within the institution, starting by saying that people are not stupid, so people looking in agriculture and water and so on had these ideas in mind forever. That's their job to manage those things. But things have really changed if you compare even when I joined 5 years ago and now, in the sense that a lot of people had these very sectoral interventions in mind, or they had in mind interventions to build resilience or to reduce risk, but again, very targeted interventions. And I think we moved to a situation where it's really considered as a mean to an end to work on resilience. So I noted, Beth, you mentioned that resilience is a development objective, and I think in a lot of what we have written at the World Bank, we have tried to avoid putting that as an objective, just to keep repeating that our objective is still like poverty reduction and development, and that's really like a way to get there, but it should not be an objective per se, because there are a lot of trade-offs. And so this, I think, was supported by a lot of work to show the impact of disasters and lack of resilience on poverty, so that we could really attach that to our mandate and explain. And it's also something we did on climate change, and we worked on the shockwave reports. The point was exactly the same, saying we're not doing climate for climate, we're not doing resilience for resilience, we're doing climate and resilience because it's important for our target in terms of poverty reduction. So really showing it as a pathway much more than an objective. In parallel, there are like two big moves that took place. One is trying to look at disasters not only as a humanitarian imperatives, but also as a development challenge. And I'll get back to that in a bit. And also trying to move from response to more like planning and ex-ante intervention. And I think the next steps that we see now in front of us in terms of how we move this agenda is really to bring the fragility and conflict area and the natural disaster area, and to try to bring things together better. And of course, what has been happening in Africa in the last month is a typical example of that, because you can make the case that it's really the combination of the drought and the conflict and the fragility that is responsible for the situation and not the two things independently. So it's really like a move towards something which is a tool that we use to achieve our goals and something that should be included in everything. And this has translated into changes in institutional terms. So as I said, resilience, or maybe it was not called resilience at the time, but was embedded in water, agriculture, and many other things. But the move towards mainstreaming that into everything we do, I guess, started in 2004. So not saying that we started before USAID, of course, but
That's what you're saying. That's what you're saying.
I think that the tsunami in 2004 was really like a game changer for us in terms of how answering to such a big event could not be done independently from development. It's just so big. Reconstruction was doing development, and I think it helped really like engaging with people who were maybe not very much engaged into the disaster field and to bring them on board. And it also led to the creation of the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, which, even though it has a bad name that French people cannot pronounce, has really played a big role internally by really pushing people in very different sectors to think about natural disasters and think about how they could contribute to this agenda. So I think it started like very often with a small group of people with a mandate to push this agenda inside the institution, using donor money to help do new things and innovate. And what we can see now is in some sectors, like strengthening hydromet systems and supporting early warning systems, it started within GFDR, and now it has become something that is being done by teams and do not need to be separated in a specific unit. So it has been slowly moving toward the mainstream World Bank stuff, and we're trying to open new ideas and to push new things. So there is this idea that you have an institution within the institution pushing the agenda, and as soon as an agenda is mature, we let it go and move to something different. We have been helped a lot also by the climate change agenda, and after the Paris Agreement, we did the Climate Change Action Plan with a lot of sectoral commitments on resilience and disaster risk, which really helped also bring that everywhere. So now we have about between 4 and 6 billion in investment per year in disaster risk management and resilience. It's about 10% of the lending we're doing, so it's a very healthy part of the activity, but it's not where most of the progress is right now. Most of the progress is not in those numbers, but more in all of the initiatives in different sectors to bring this resilience framework within what people are doing in transport, in social protection, in poverty, and so on. So it doesn't count in the portfolio analysis, so it's difficult to measure, but I think this is really where the value is coming from. You asked me to talk about the role of evidence, and I will just conclude on that point. I think, so first, we have to recognize that most of the evidence is not evidence of what works, but it's still evidence of lack of resilience, with big disasters happening repeatedly. So I think what has been helping us the most, unfortunately, is more like bad stories, more bad stories than good stories. And I think it's important to recognize that we still have a lot of that going on. We have more and more case studies, not only on what works, but also on the impact of disasters and lack of resilience on development. And I want to stress all of the evidence on the impact on children through health, nutrition, and education. Because if you think about the future of those countries, I think focusing on this very vulnerable population is really something that we have to push on it. And everybody understands that if poor people cannot protect their children, then their children will be poor. And this is maybe the most unfair thing, that poverty is transmitted from parents to their children. I think it's a very powerful argument to try to help parents protect their kids from those disasters. What we found, and I don't know if you share this sentiment, but case studies are not very efficient when we try to communicate. And that's why we made a lot of efforts to do this big modeling effort where we use case studies to inform the modeling, but then we can provide global numbers. So in Unbreakable, we have this number that natural disasters bring 26 million people in poverty every year. It's a combination of case studies and modeling, but we found it much easier to communicate with those big global numbers. And case studies, you always get people answering, oh yes, but that's a special case, and so it's very difficult, I find, to sell them. So the way we communicate, it's not only about having the evidence. There is a big question for me about how do we make this evidence more convincing. And one critical thing on this, and that's very important for the impact evaluation we have, is that we have framed our action in terms of scaling up. So trying to do resilience not through pilots, but can we scale up to something that makes a difference at the global scale? And I think that's the problem we have with a lot of the pilots and impact evaluation we have. They show good success. The question is, how do you prove that this can be scaled up? And for insurance, for instance, I think this is the big challenge. So I guess, I'm not sure, I can talk for this like for hours. So at one point somebody has to wave arms because otherwise I keep talking all day.
You're good right now.
I'm good right now. I just wanted to also flag in terms of the evidence that, so I don't know if it's part of the evidence, but a lot of work has been done in terms to develop the tools that people who are not specialists of resilience can use, so that if I'm a transport engineer and I build roads or railways or an urbanist, I can bring resilience into what I think. And we cannot expect people to become resilient experts. Some of us have spent like decades on that, so it's maybe easier to talk about it, but I think we have to do much more efforts to make it like easier for people to bring these ideas into everything they do. And we have worked a lot with infrastructure engineers, try to make them move from the, I can predict the future and I can develop this fancy optimal piece of infrastructure based on that, and try to move them towards something which is more like stress testing, like what if something happens that I did not expect? What if my forecast is wrong? What if I have a surprise? And trying to test the vulnerability of the project we're financing, trying to expand the range of uncertainties that we think is possible. So trying to look outside what happened in the past and trying to push people to demonstrate that what they are doing is not dependent on not having a big surprise in terms of technology, demographics, conflicts, or climate change, or whatever. So this, I think, is really important. And since this is also about creating collaborations, I just want to flag a few things that we're doing in that domain. We're trying to launch a work program on infrastructure resilience and supply chain resilience, just to try to move a bit the debate from only the supply side, so I make my infrastructure resilient, to something which is also about demand. So how do I make my economy and my communities better able to cope with an interruption in electricity, water, transport? So looking also at the demand side of the equation and see how we can basically ask less from our infrastructure, because it's very difficult and very costly, by making the users maybe more resilient. So anybody who wants to work on this, just come to see me. The other thing that we're working on in that domain is to develop questionnaires for household surveys and methodologies for household surveys to get a better sense at the impact of disasters, and especially not the big one that we've been talking about, not the tsunami, not the big drought, but like the floods happening every year in Jakarta and Mumbai, for instance. What the impact for these people affected, not so much, it's not on TV, but it's every year, and it has an impact on their ability to improve housing, to an impact on the health, especially again for children and women. So what are the cumulative impacts on those little things that poor people are facing all the time? So similarly, we have done the pilot in Accra, Ghana, a few months ago, and we'll try to go into different places. So if somebody's interested, we're very happy to share what we have done and to get your feedback on that. The last tool that we're trying to work on at the moment is M&E and tracking progress over time. So a few years ago, I went on mission, missed an important meeting, and when I came back, I was in charge of developing a resilience indicator. That was not good news, and that's what led to the Unbreakable report, where we're trying to propose a resilience indicator, which, as always, isn't perfect, is too narrow, and there are many things that we're missing into this, but we're really trying to have a tool that looks beyond the traditional field of disaster risk management looking at inequalities, looking at social protection, at financial instruments, and trying to look at whether we can track the change over time. And we will keep working on that in the next months. We're also working at the country level, at the project level. So I build a road, and I measure the resilience benefits from that. And this has revealed extremely challenging, because one of the conclusions of our work on that is that each project is different. So you can develop indicators at the project level to measure the resilience benefits, but if somebody asks, take the World Bank portfolio and aggregate everything into how much resilience benefits you produced, just no way. And really, I don't think this is something that we'll be able to do in the next years, decades, centuries, whatever. So there is a question of how do we manage that? Because of course we want to show results, but at the same time we don't want to use bad indicators. So I just want to conclude now first by saying that I'm asked very often, is resilience is just a new word for things that we have been doing for a long time. I think the answer is really yes and no. Yes, it rebrands some of what we've been doing, but there is still a big difference in putting it at the forefront and to using it to think about development. And I see more and more of the World Bank teams doing the country strategies coming to us very early in their process saying, how can I use resilience as an entry point? And I think this is new and this is really, really useful. So it might be a bit of marketing, but I think it leads to better development. And I think this is really something that we should just keep pushing. You know, French people are always complaining, so I'll just finish with complaints. So there are two things that I'm a bit worried about, and that I think we should keep in mind. So this is about evidence, and we're really looking for quantified evidence, really looking for numbers. And I love numbers. I mean, that's what I do for a living. At the same time, I'm very worried that by accepting to use quantified indicators, which are very imperfect, we create an incentive for development professionals to just do the wrong thing. And we have examples in healthcare, security, education, of the very bad impact that bad indicators can have. And I think as professionals in the field, there is really a responsibility at one point to push back and saying, we can produce you an indicator, but if it's not good enough, maybe it will push people to do like this huge infrastructure, very costly, because we focus on how much we invest in resilience, for instance, and not doing the cheap and smart things that cost nothing. And there are a lot of negative, unintended consequences of using bad indicators. So I think the bar that we should put on those indicators is very, very high. We have to make sure it won't lead us to do bad things. And the second worry is that it's also very, very good that we're pushing toward cross-sectoral interventions and working at the strategic level. One of the things that we need to keep doing is the very simple targeted interventions in one sector. So you're working on floods in big cities. Solid waste management is something that you do. It's not cross-sectoral. It's not new. It's not sophisticated. But if you don't get it right, there's no way you will manage your floods. So we have to also keep in mind that sometimes not everything has to be cross-sectoral and integrated and complicated. Sometimes very simple things work, and we also have to keep pushing them. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much again for the invitation.
Great, thank you. And then a couple of reflections quickly is I think that one of the things that we found, and I think you're sort of helping express, is this is in part marketing, and that isn't a bad thing. I actually had like a self-realization about a year ago that a good chunk of my job is marketing. But it's very powerful evidence has made this concept of resilience gain support. And it is really important for those of us that go up to the Hill and are sort of explaining what this work is. So yes, I think it is important to acknowledge that it's a part of it, but not a bad thing, as you say. The other thing, and one of the reasons I'm really excited, is this whole notion of, you said we're dealing with negative impacts. That's a lot of what our measurement is. And I think that's true. That's the motivator. But as we begin to build that evidence about how we're averting some of those, even if it's not scaled, that's really the powerful evidence that allows people to understand, hey, this isn't just relabeling what we already did. There is something else here. And there's also something to the fact that resilience as a concept, where we used to focus on vulnerability and deficits, resilience flips that idea and focuses on capacities, strengths, abilities. And I think it does send us in different directions, and that's part of the reason social capital, women's empowerment, aspiration have sort of risen. They wouldn't typically have risen if we hadn't looked at it differently. So thank you. Next, we'll have Imogen Parsons from DFID. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I feel like as I'm the fifth person to speak now, I'm already at risk of repeating quite a lot of what's already been said, but at least I'm not last. So I think for DFID, as for everyone else who's spoken so far, for us this really originates from around 2011-12 as well, in its most strongest and most meaningful sense. It wasn't brand new then. It appeared in the Humanitarian Emergency Response Review. Oh, thank you. Which was published in 2011. It appeared in the Humanitarian Policy that appeared around then, and a specific paper on disaster resilience. But it was really that experience of the drought in East Africa that made it really live and real. And I think when the numbers came out that said that some 250,000 people died who didn't need to die, that really made it very personal for a lot of us, especially those of us who worked there at the time. I think for us as an organisation, we had a real moment of realising that actually we hadn't done enough. We hadn't responded early enough. We hadn't gone big enough. And we needed to do more and do better in the future. And some of that was just about some of our own procedures, the way we were set up, what we could do, how quickly we could do it. So we've made a lot of effort since then to try and change those things and to work across the whole system to make things faster and better. And to try and not just to respond after the fact, to respond earlier, and to build the resilience to stop the consequences from being so dramatic in the first place. I think as we've also heard, I think some of the big numbers are really important, and that's come out a couple of times. There was that one experience, but actually some of those big figures, like I've just seen something, £29 billion a year across 77 countries, the cost of natural disasters. Those do also pitch it beyond the more humanitarian moral argument, and they make it very much a financial and an economic argument as well. I mean, this is really big economic development costs we're talking about as well. So while resilience has come from, if you like, our humanitarian side and policy, and is very firmly embedded there, it has spread across our whole organisation now. I think our climate colleagues have probably picked up the banner and run with it the furthest within the organisation. We have a lot of investment now around climate-related natural disasters, but it's going into other sectors as well. Our social protection colleagues, I see social protection on the agenda, have responded very strongly to this. Our health and education colleagues are also very interested in thinking about how they can take some of this thinking and embed it in their programs at the same time. I think where we probably have the furthest to go is around this question of fragility and conflict, and I'll come back to that as well. So I just wanted to pick out a few areas and just talk a bit more in detail about what we've done and the role that evidence has played in that, but also where we still need to go in terms of gathering more evidence. The first one is around early action. We've made a very strong commitment on this, and I do think, having worked on our crises while I was running our Africa Humanitarian Unit, and having then been on the evidence side since then, I do think we've made progress on that. We really do respond earlier. We get decisions up to our ministers much earlier. They make decisions really very quickly. I feel like that is something we've done a lot on. Evidence has had a lot to do with that. I'm not sure where Courtney is, but I know she's speaking a bit later. So the paper that Courtney did with us in about 2011-12 is probably one of the most commonly cited pieces of evidence in our decision-making process in DFID now, I think. It appears all the time, and it's now since been refreshed, so we've got some new numbers to work with. But just that very clear argument that if you respond earlier, you save money, and saving money means that you can save more lives, or you can invest more in resilience, you can do all kinds of things with that money. It's very, very powerful, and it's become sort of accepted. You know, that argument is not questioned within DFID now. It's clear to everybody. I think we've worked with her on some more recent pieces. I think in the case of Ethiopia in the last couple of years, we've shown that actually we really did make a difference. We saved, in fact, that was 7 million or something, which might not sound huge, but it's 20% of the cost of the response. It is a significant amount, and the modelling on a global scale suggests that we could be saving more than $1 billion, actually, if we did this, and I'll let her talk more about that rather than take all of her thunder right now. Another study we've supported on preparedness has shown a figure of about 1.6 as return from preparedness. That's slightly less than the 2.9 from resilience, but it sits alongside that quite positively. And that's just the costs from earlier procurement. I think if you also add to that the benefits in terms of nutrition, reducing malnutrition rates, in terms of mortality and morbidity, and the carbon savings as well, actually, from reducing the amount of air transport we have to do. Actually, there's a big package of benefits there. Where we, I think, need more evidence is really showing how this works at the household level. I think we've got a lot better at our level at getting all of our systems in place. There is a bit further to go in terms of working out how we ensure that the delivery systems are there to reach the households that really need it in a really comprehensive way. And I think, as we've heard, the evidence seems to be showing that a strong package of interventions makes a big difference. So we need to make sure that people are getting all of the assistance they need. Having very single sector focus is a lot less effective. So more kind of joined up systems for assessing people's vulnerability and getting the aid to them seems to be the way we need to go. The next area is around sort of adaptation and shock responsive, because it's not just about us improving our systems and our ability to respond earlier. It's also about giving households themselves the ability to anticipate when a crisis is coming. And not just in the very short term, this is happening in the next few months, but to think actually over the slightly longer term about the kinds of trends that we're seeing and what that might mean for them in terms of their livelihood strategies, what's actually going to make a difference to them being able to cope in the crisis in 5 years as well as the one next year. We've put a lot of effort into forecasting, into early warning. At the moment, I think that's probably stronger with us and our decision making. We need to do a lot more to make sure that that gets right down to households themselves so that the information is reaching the grassroots as well. In some places it does, in others it's less, we have less good coverage. And perhaps that's normal because there's a lot of people out there who need this kind of information. It's going to take time to get the coverage where we need it to be. We have seen through our BRACE program, for instance, that actually where people do have this information, it does make a difference. They are more able to anticipate and to change what they're doing in order to deal with shocks. At the national level, our focus has been quite heavily on social protection. We've invested a huge amount in social protection programs. Ethiopia and Kenya are always the examples we give, but actually there are a number of others out there as well. We're working in the Sahel as well. We put a lot of money into trying to get some of those programs stronger and delivering. Our latest focus on research, the research side, is really around how we can make those programs better able to anticipate and to adapt. So either to expand their target caseload, so to reach more people when more people need help, or to increase the amount of assistance that people are getting. And the evidence we're getting back on that is that this is a really powerful thing to do, but you have to make sure the systems are strong and mature first. Actually, just having a social protection system, a safety net there in the first place, is itself a very valuable resilience measure. So, let's not beat ourselves up if these aren't all Rolls-Royce systems just yet. Just having it is a very positive thing. And if we can then build on that so that it does become more sophisticated, then that's great, and that can be very powerful as well. The research is about to be published, I think, that we've done on that. It looks at some other case studies beyond the obvious ones as well, so Lesotho in the Philippines, as well as the Sahel and Ethiopia, Kenya. I think the multi-sectoral point is really important. We've just done some research on use of cash and the impact on malnutrition in Niger, Pakistan and Somalia. And that's shown in 2 of the case studies that cash alone isn't enough, and it's the health interventions that seem to be really important to complement the cash transfers in reducing malnutrition. In one case, malaria seemed to be the really important thing, in another it was vaccination. So it's going to depend a bit on which case. Pakistan, I think, had the greatest success rates in bringing down malnutrition just through the cash alone. But again, it is this question of working out in which place what combination is needed. It's not going to be the same everywhere. We've looked as well at timeframes. I think this is a really important point. So our research projects have tended to be a couple of years long, which is already slightly longer than most humanitarian projects. It's probably a similar length to most resilient projects. We're finding that the longer the time frame in terms of assessing what the benefit of an intervention, the more likely you are to see a benefit in general. So some of the water projects, for instance, that we commonly do and then find a year later actually maybe haven't delivered. Actually, if you look, I think it's 22 months is the break-even point. So recent studies showed that for borehole projects started in an emergency, after 22 months you get a return on your investment. And that includes a period of water trucking at the start. So actually, if you look longer, you can start to see benefits where otherwise you might not have done. So I think, all of this, we've got this sort of patchwork of different bits of evidence around what delivers and what doesn't. What we're finding now is we need to start pulling all of that together. So getting a lot clearer on the granular level of what in which place is really effective and what combination, rather than trying to just draw out one intervention and saying, this is it. At the same time, the long time frames point I think is really important, because it's not just about assessing the impact of one intervention, it's also at looking at those longer trends. So things like migration, for instance. It's not clear yet whether migration in some cases is a positive or a negative in terms of people's adaptation. Remittances, I think we mentioned already, really, really important in some places in supporting households who are affected by crises. The amounts of support people are getting from remittances can be very, very significant, and can be at least as much as people are getting from humanitarian aid. So in that case, it may be that the migration has been a very positive factor. At the same time, we also know that it isn't always. So we need to get a bit more, a bit clearer on what we understand on that, on whether it's positive or a negative. The last area I want to talk about is risk financing. This is one where we've done a huge amount of work in DFID, partly because of a realization that the systems we're investing in are great, but a system can only work and can only adapt if it's got the money coming into it. So some of the social protection focus, for instance, a program can only expand to reach more people if it's got money to reach more people. It can only give more support to people if it's got more money to do that. At the same time, governments can only start to take more ownership of their own humanitarian response if they've got the funding to do that. And actually reallocating from other budgets can be quite damaging. So we wanted to come up with a way of saying, well, actually, this can be an extra, but we don't have to wait for a very long process of donors deciding to give money. We funded a project with the World Bank, with GFDR, called Dull Disasters, which was called the Sovereign Risk Financing Initiative, I think, which is a bit less catchy, so I'll go with Dull Disasters. That's got a huge amount of traction within DFID, and it's about saying, actually, we shouldn't be waiting until after crisis, when, yes, it's fast-moving and it's exciting. We should be trying to make this planned, predictable, actually dulling both the impact and making it more, less exciting. Like insurance, I think is the phrase used in the book, which I don't mean to be disparaging to any insurance colleagues who may be here. But the idea is that we make it something that actually we can really plan and predict as early as possible. So there are no great surprises, because most disasters are actually predictable in some way. So this has led to us supporting the launch of a Centre for Global Disaster Protection, which I think is due to launch next year, which is a partnership with the World Bank, and we'll be working with insurance firms, with a wide range of private sector, with universities, research institutions, to try and support countries to design risk financing systems that work for the poorest. There's a focus on sovereign risk, but actually it's not just about that. That's where this research has come from, but it's intended to look at a broader range of risk financing. So last of all, and I think I've probably gone on a bit too long as well, future directions for us, things I think we should be focusing on, broadening our sectoral focus. So for instance, food security or nutrition goals, we need to be including health interventions in many cases, looking wider than just one. Thinking systemically, so everything from the early warning, the anticipation, through the systems that can deliver in a crisis, through the finance, a whole systems approach rather than just taking one bit as we've sometimes tended to in the past. Taking longer time frames, thinking longer term in terms of the return on investment, as well as about understanding longer term trends and what those mean, both as drivers and sources of resilience. Beyond natural disasters, so looking at protracted crises, looking at conflict. Protracted crises are still the bulk of humanitarian aid, so I think unless we start going into those, we're not going to get the kind of big shift that we really want to. Not so much resilience to conflict, although we are interested in how the sort of shock responsive approach might work in a conflict setting. Can systems flex and adapt to receive more displaced people, for instance, and include them instead of having to set up a parallel humanitarian system? But also, how does resilience look different in a fragile and conflict-affected state? And it may be that a focus on assets is less appropriate, for instance, if it's highly insecure. Having a large number of assets might not be a sign of resilience, it might actually make you very vulnerable in that sort of setting. And perhaps having to understand a bit more the psychological consequences of conflict and what those do to people's decision making as well. I think it's an area we haven't looked at sufficiently, but there's a lot in there. And keeping a broad focus, I think this has come up as well. There isn't one indicator. A lot of our research is showing that the way that people adapt to and deal with crises is very different. Every household, even within one village, might respond differently. And actually that might be okay. It might be okay that they all do something different because each of them has a different combination of things that might allow them to cope. So we need to be quite careful in not generalizing too much about what resilience looks like, and really get under the skin of what it means for people who are affected.
Great, thank you, Imogen. I mean, I think this issue about cross-sectoral approaches is an important one that both Stefan and Imogen spoke to. We don't want to be blind here and dump a pre-cooked package of interventions and say that's what resilience looks like. And I think that's part of the reason we're so excited to engage this next 2 days, to really dive in to understand what are sources of resilience, what transcends context, but which ones are sort of context specific. Because I do think we need that sort of granular understanding. And it's as you say, Imogen, not even sort of homogeneity at the village level. There are some households, as I said, are stepping up, others are stepping out, some are moving out of agriculture, for example. And that's driven by differences in aspirations, assets, resources, and we need to understand that. I also just, to reiterate this sort of value for money work, I mean, I think we use that. We also use your statistic, every dollar invested in resilience, 2.9. We like the almost false specificity of 2.9, and when someone tries to round it to 3, I say, no, don't do that. We also like that we can say, it's a different study. So thank you, Imogen, and with that, I'll pass to Renate.
Yeah, a lot has been said, but I think I will come on from a little bit of a different perspective because I'm not so much from the knowledge side so far. So I'm not coming in really from the evidence knowledge that both of you have spoken about, because that's not the strength of the European Union. We are more a political animal. We are more a convener of our member states. I also would like to start with this reference to 2011-2012, when I heard first on resilience, very much in the context of food security, the Horn and Sahel, and who was struggling to take the lead over it, the humanitarian or the development people, or the two together. We have gone beyond this year from the European Union point of view, and come out with a new communication. A communication is our way to communicate and submit proposals to our member states. The lead was not taken from the European Commission, but from the European External Action Service, where we have our people that do diplomacy and security. And what they did, they brought together the entire European Commission and basically fostering a whole of government, whole of EU approach to resilience. That was a bit of a shock, I think, for everybody, to look into this, to contribute to this very bigger thing, and to talk to each other more closely. So it would mean not only to have our humanitarian and development colleagues come in, but also our directorates general for you here in the US, it would be the departments of environment, climate change, infrastructure, energy, the people that work on security, and to have all them come up with something together. So what is this then that comes up? It's something that is more general, of course, because everybody comes from their own perspectives. So what we are trying to do is go away from this resilience around food security concept and move to state and societal resilience, with a center of looking at inclusive and participatory societies. So how can we help at all levels in a country resilient societies in terms of having inclusive societies, applicable of rule of law, have accountable institutions, not only at national level, because often their at national level is weak, so community level as well. Economic resilience. We have heard already insurance mechanisms, cash transfer systems, that kind of things, that we keep that in mind. It's part of the overall resilience concept. Climate and environmental resilience. There I've been very surprised that that came in, because that means also not looking at how heavy is an impact, but also how often does it come? Is there regularity or not? How can we predict these things? How can we prepare in all the other dimensions to take into account the climate and environmental aspects of resilience? Then also looking at the prevention and peace building things around conflicts. So not only looking at fragility in terms of food security, but fragility in terms of conflict exposures. Resilience in protracted crisis situations. How can we deal with that? We have more and more protracted crisis situations around the world. Then also these elements, resilience and forced displacement, resilience and migration. You have spoken about that, those that adapt by either deciding we go, or people that are forced because of drought to push their animals into other areas to be able to survive. And last but not least, and that was also for me quite interesting coming from the development perspective, is security. But there it was more looking at the security of the EU. And also then what does it mean for the EU, and how do we need to help our own partner countries dealing with security threats? On the one hand, this is hybrid threats, cybersecurity threats. How can we support our partner countries in preparing for being resilient against these kind of threats? And we have also said we need to work on these different dimensions in 4 building blocks. The one is improve analysis of risks and of resilience factors, both. Take environment. There is a lot of, and climate change. There is probably a lot of overlapping and multiplicity of risk assessments. But the processes are normally done, these assessment processes are done from different perspectives. So humanitarian, conflict, environmental, but then there are gaps still. For instance, can we predict the impact of climate change, of environmental threats, of other factors that would then also trigger migration movements? We give too little evidence so far on, and emphasis on, local resilience capacities and positive dynamics that they can generate. So look at why does that community manage to keep peace around them and deal with conflicts, and it's not happening in another context? So look at these as well. We want to better integrate resilience approaches in our programming and financing, and also to work more closely with international partners, OECD, World Bank, UN, regional organizations, but also NATO and OSCE. So there we come back to security organizations. When we as EU do, we also always say it's very good that we try to already work better amongst ourselves, but we also invite our member states to work more closely with us. So to do more joint analysis together in conflict-affected countries and in conflict areas. We invite them to do joint planning and programming together, and also to enhance the mobilization of our diplomatic resources together with our member states. So how will this start working in practice? I think the first follow-up to this communication has been that our development ministers have decided, beginning of September, that we should better work together in Humanitarian and Development Nexus, and to bring better together our field offices that doing either humanitarian or development, because the responsibilities within governments are not at the same entity. And we have decided with the member states to come together, not only to implement what we have managed to do within the institution, to work more closely and work really as partners, but also to do this with the member states. And we have come up with 6 pilot countries, so we are at piloting, not at taking to scale. We can't do this with the member states. We need to start with pilots and then say it works if you are happy to come on board. And we do not ask 28 member states to come on board. We ask them who wants to come on board. So there will be a complex situation, or not so complex, because it's only a few countries that said, yes, we want to come on board, and country X, country Y, country Z. Just to tell you the countries that have been selected for these pilot operations, the one is in there, I must say, probably it's not quite the right one choice, because this was beginning of September, Myanmar, Rakhine State, Rohingyas. Perhaps we should have rather thought of Myanmar and Bangladesh, but it was only in a few weeks that there have been so many people moving from one part of the border to the other side of the border. So that's something I would be happy to observe how this will effectively develop. The other is Iraq, and then 4 countries in Africa. So far it would be, let me look this up. It was Chad, Nigeria, Niger, and then let me quickly look what we said, Uganda, Sudan. So all these countries are not really a surprise to anybody working on conflict and fragility. What I have observed in terms of evidence, but just in terms of evidence how we are changing our way of doing things, is since a few years already, is how we work with our financial instruments. Like you have in the US, you have appropriations, or we call it budget lines. We have a budget line for humanitarian, and we have different budget lines for development, applying to different regions that are no longer suitable to react to complex situations that require tackling conflict, disasters, protracted crisis situations, man-made or natural-made. We have created trust funds, which is new for the European Union. We haven't been allowed to do this until 2013. Our trust funds, when they come, they are big. They are at least 500 million. We have created trust funds bringing together the humanitarian funding and different funding from different budget lines to be able to tackle situations in emergency situations, but that are not emergencies like you said 22 months of an intervention to able to see progress. Syrian refugees in Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, this is much longer than 22 months. And we have also created trust funds, so we have created trust funds around and other instruments to help the situation in these situations, but also in Africa. And this is basically a very funny instrument. It's an emergency trust fund to tackle the root causes of migration. So don't tell me there's something emergency and root causes. The one is very short term, the other one is very long term. But at least it's something where we said we need to work on this. I wanted to close with one reference that you had. It's the narrative thing. Do we talk about fragility and conflict, or do we talk about resilience? Because it gives another spin to people and another task also to people that work on these issues. I also wanted to conclude with another remark that was just a few weeks ago, that was after Irma hit the Caribbean countries. On day one after that, there was a very positive news, and it was a World Bank press release that said these are the allocations stemming from an insurance facility.
The CRIF.
The CRIF, exactly, which doesn't wait for assessment of damage, but has another mechanism to allocate funds immediately. And it said really the day after, these are the allocations to the different countries. They can draw on this money immediately. So this is an excellent example of very, very quick reaction and availability of funding. So this is, for me, a very good evidence that there are instruments in place. And I'm also happy to say we are contributing to that one.
Thank you, Renate. That's excellent. I think one thing we've heard now several times is this intersection between resilience and fragility and conflict. And I think it's some challenging, nuanced terms we're using here. We have heard people here talk about resilience as being the opposite of fragility. And I think we've sort of all expressed a discomfort with that sort of exact fit, but clearly we're talking about concentric circles. And I do agree with you, Renate, that the one I sort of hinted at it earlier, one of the powerful things about resilience as a concept is its focus on the capacities, the abilities, rather than the deficits and the vulnerabilities. And that does push us in new directions. So maybe it's that we're looking for some resilience-like term, and I don't think a legitimate and effective governance quite rings the same way. But I do think we are going to have a session on resilience and fragility. We've already actually had a couple of meetings here with partners about it. And I think it is clearly because hunger and poverty are consolidating in fragile spaces, because as Tom noted this year, we've got 4 near famine situations that are sometimes intersecting with natural hazards, as in Somalia, but clearly have a man-made element. I also think it's important to not say, as someone said here, it's not really about building resilience to conflict. Conflict's not exactly the same thing as a drought. I mean, it may need to be mitigated and managed in the short term, but a long-term vision should be actually reducing and eliminating that risk. So a lot to chew on there for sure. So we've got about 9 minutes before the break. And I think we can go ahead and take a couple questions from the audience. That one shut up awful fast, Jennifer.
So I did, the
introduce yourself.
Sorry. Hi, Jennifer Karshner, USAID Niger. So my question, I hear a lot about what you're saying on the capacities. My question is creating incentives, because what we see is even when people have the capacities, they're still making horrible decisions. So how do you create government incentives to do the right thing for their populations?
Let's maybe take 1 or 2 more, and then we'll sort of field it around the panel. Far back.
Good morning. Christy Tabai with Save the Children and the TOPS program. Stefan, you had mentioned 2 problems or issues that you're thinking about right now. One of them dealing with, if I captured it correctly, the quantitative measurement that we tried to put around resilience. And I'm wondering, you offered the concern, but you didn't offer any thoughts about maybe how that can be solved. So I'd like to hear about your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Great, so let's go ahead and get started with the first question. Capacities may be there, but people make maybe not the choice you would make, Jennifer, in terms of using those capacities. I think you're asking in relation to government, but I think the same is true when we talk about people's own resilience capacities, and I think there's some interesting nuance. I'm looking at Christophe Benet around the existence of capacities and whether or not people employ them in the face of a particular shock event. That's an interesting measurement issue. But anyone from the panel care to grapple with this one?
I think this is amazingly difficult, because actually we don't necessarily always understand why people do make the decisions they do. And in the absence of really understanding that, it's quite hard to say how to change it. I think there are some general things. One thing we thought about quite a lot is the moral hazard question, if you like, and how significant is that? So with things like humanitarian funding, how do we avoid creating an incentive for people or governments, people at whatever level, not to prepare for a crisis because they know that we will come in with the cavalry afterwards, if you like. So actually, how do we shift the incentive so that it really is there to prepare for beforehand, instead of waiting because they know that there will be a lot of results coming afterwards. I actually don't know how often that does happen, because I think if I would put myself in that position, I would probably still want to be prepared. But it is something we've tried to think about in the way that risk financing systems, for instance, are designed, so that there is more benefit, if you like, from being having the plans in place early, from releasing finance early from within their own systems, instead of just waiting for funding to come in later.
I'm being reminded we need to speak into the microphones.
Sorry. Okay. Did people hear that, or do I need to repeat? It's okay. I think that's a really big thing. I think the conflict question, actually, I do want to just touch on as well, because I think when we talk about why do people make the decisions they do, I think probably people make different decisions in very fragile and conflict-affected situations than they would do in a more a stable, predictable setting, because they're dealing with a whole different set of things going on, and they might be dealing with both the psychological impact of a conflict, which I think it's been shown that very high levels of stress do create different approach to decision making. You focus much more short term in general, not just in a conflict setting, in any kind of setting. Stress changes the way you respond under pressure and the way you make decisions. So there is something there about how we approach people's decision making in the first place, and the extent to which we perhaps support certain, we support communities or we support local authorities in those kind of situations, and it's gonna be different. I think that's probably
great. I mean, I think I would just chime in before passing to Stefan to maybe tackle the second question, is this idea of motivating analytics. I mean, I think one of the reasons we were able to get traction here in our own government around making long-term investments in places people had long thought of as sort of that's where we do humanitarian stuff, was to create an evidence base that explained how damn expensive it was to not do it. And I think the analytics differ when you're dealing with a donor versus a partner government, and I do think that powerful analytic in Kenya, $12.1 billion, that's what the national economy took a hit from unfettered drought. So I think there are a set of powerful sort of analytics, and they have to be done at different scales, not just national government, other scales.
Actually, can I just say one more thing? You just reminded me, there was a study we did with the World Bank in Pakistan that you might have come across, and I think that was very powerful, actually, because it did exactly that, and it modelled at a very specific level really how much it costs to respond late. And I think on the back of that, we have seen a lot of movement in terms of local level preparedness and finance from within different parts of the government. And I think probably it was that engaging people and coming up with some very big and very nasty looking numbers that probably shifted things.
Stefan?
Yeah, just before moving on the second one, I think there's, in a workshop on evidence, there's one thing which is really important, is the good decisions won't be made if the people affected have no voice. And one of the role of this evidence is to give voice to the people who don't have one. And that's why I'm so focused on the very frequent shocks, because they're really the one like nobody cares about. Like the floods occurring like every year in the same place are not making it to the media and the news. They are not recorded in databases. So these household surveys that we're trying to do at the moment really tries to show what's hidden behind these very frequent shocks, to make that more visible and hopefully make better decisions. But I also wanted to say that we have to be very careful when we're talking about the bad decisions. I think Michael is in the room in the back, looking at people smoothing consumption while we would expect them to use their assets to, people not smoothing consumption while we would expect them to use their assets to smooth consumption, is considered like a detrimental coping strategy, which we might be able to explain because people are trying to protect their assets because they don't see a long-term vision if they use their assets to cope with the shock. So in some cases, also, we have to be very careful trying to really understand why people are making what we think are bad choices, to really understand the reason. A little bit like these people moving into flood zones in cities, and we're all complaining that these people are moving in flood zones. And when we did surveys in Mumbai, it was interesting because we had these ridiculous questions like, do you know you're living in the flood zone? And the answer was, I'm flooded every year, thanks, noticed. And looking into this, you just realize like there is no way these people can get some decent schools for the kids and some healthcare without living in the flood zone, and that's the trade-off that they are making, and it changes everything about how you think about urban planning, right? You don't want to do zoning to keep people out of those places. You want to invest in infrastructure to create new safe land that these people can go to. So you completely reverse the way you're talking about it if you understand the behavior. So in many cases, there are bad decisions. In some cases, we're just like missing the point from time to time. On the second question, you noticed that I don't have a solution for that? Damn.
Also very French.
So we have a lot of pressure to quantify. We have all of this like result-based and value for money and so on, which is all based on quantifying what we're doing, and if possible, at the portfolio level. And I think that we have to be very clear that we have to work on that. We have to get better. But also that there are things we can do and things that we just cannot do. And when we cannot do it, I mean, it's always possible to cook numbers, right? It's not that difficult. But my recommendation was not so much about how we could try to do it. It's to recognize that at one point it might be just out of reach, and we have to find other ways of creating incentives and checking the result of our interventions. I understand where people are coming from when they're asking for that, and we have to acknowledge that it's important that we report on the outcome of what we're doing. At the same time, I think there are like ways of creating the right incentives, which are not only based on these very aggregated indicators that do not give a lot of space for the people actually doing the projects to do smart things. Just because it's not in the list of things that count. So if you're doing innovation and you're out of the list, then it doesn't count, and your boss is just like, why don't you do a project that contributes to my 28% target that I have for this year, and things like this. So how do we keep the flexibility in measurements? And I don't have a good answer except that we have to say it's not that easy again and again, and not being afraid to say, sorry, I can't do it, and I won't create this indicator that you're asking because it would be leading to bad projects and bad development and people suffering. So I don't know how we do that, but I think it's important that we all do it because there is a bad incentive also in the group, right? So
we're going to have a chance to continue the question and answers, and it's going to be a little bit more of an interactive session after the break, but we do want to keep to time, and we are at the break period. But I think that point that I think it was Albert Einstein that said, not everything that matters can be measured, not everything that can be measured matters. So I think there is an element of that here, although